I'm a male, 48, and this happened when I was a teenager. It was Halloween night. My mom and dad had a party to go to, so it was my job to take my little brother trick-or-treating. We went around the closest neighborhoods before we stopped at my uncle's house like we did every year. My uncle invited us inside to have a glass of apple cider, a piece of pie, and to gossip about the things that had been happening at my school. We helped pass out candy, watched a few of the classic Halloween movies, and generally had a good time catching up with my uncle and his wife. It's the usual thing that I had done since I was a kid. It was getting late, and we were getting ready to leave when a shadow passed over the window. It was very unusual for someone to be lurking around our neighborhood. My uncle had already shut off the lights when we noticed the shadow. The first thought to go through my mind was the fact that someone had escaped from the state prison that was relatively close to my uncle's property. Ridiculous, I know, but my overactive imagination would take me to some insane lengths. My uncle told me to take my brother into his study, lock the door, and don't come out until he says to. I did as told. My brother and I quickly hid in the study and watched out the window for a few minutes. It seemed to linger on forever. To my utter improbable shock, a man in an orange jumpsuit crept towards the living room window as I saw from afar. I had to rub my eyes, wondering if my imagination truly was going insane. Now, my uncle wasn't and still isn't the type of guy that you want to mess around with. He served in the military, so he kept a lot of guns in the house to protect his family. He was a bit of a nutcase. I'm not really sure what was exchanged between the lurker and my uncle, but a gunshot scared my brother enough to pee himself. I unlocked the door to the study and ran outside to see exactly what had happened. My uncle was knelt down beside the guy in the orange jumpsuit. To my surprise, he was crying and profusely apologizing for firing the gun. It turns out that my cousin had decided to dress up as a jailbird last minute. He went to a friend's party and didn't want his dad to find out that he had been drinking, which was the reason why he was lurking around the house. He was trying to sneak in without alarming anyone, but he didn't know that his dad was still awake. My uncle shot his son without hesitation. He was questioned by the police and ended up getting rid of all of his guns in his house. My cousin recovered just fine with some time in the hospital and a story to tell now that we look back on and laugh at from time to time. He went on to graduate college and become a lawyer, actually protecting those who were wrongfully assaulted, so in the end, everything came full circle. I'm 18, female, and still scared about what could have happened last year. For the sake of privacy, I'll call my girlfriend Lisa. Lisa was a beautiful, smart girl with platinum blonde hair and blue eyes that could make anyone crave her attention. I hadn't been dating Lisa very long, maybe 5 months if that. Our relationship may not have lasted long, but I didn't have any hard feelings after the traumatic event we experienced. My girlfriend and I decided to go out with a bang for our final Halloween as youths by trick-or-treating as sirens. You know, the mythical Greek creature that lures men to their death with a special song. The costumes were on the slightly exposed side, if you know what I mean. We wore short dresses with ripped stockings and high heels, which drew more attention than we had hoped. We canvassed the neighborhood, which visited Mrs. Watson's house, Dr. Harrison's house, the elderly couple whose name I forgot, and the weird guy at the end of the road. We went to a party, had a few shots of tequila, and we went to a friend's house to smoke and eventually made our way back to my house with a bag full of candy. My mom questioned us about our night on the town. I assumed that she could tell we were a little out of it, but we engaged in a friendly conversation while sorting through our scrumptious-looking treats. Being a bit clumsy on top of all that was typical for Lisa. She dropped a handful of candy, which made my mom more suspicious, and then my dogs Poncho and Lilo gobbled up as much as they could. We laughed about 2 chihuahuas licking their lips after eating a lot of caramel candies. It didn't take long for the dogs to start acting weird. They began to foam at the mouth and violently convulsing. It looked like something straight out of The Exorcist. My mom frantically scooped up Lilo and Poncho. I called the police and tried my best to calm my scared girlfriend down. The police confiscated the candy. The vet sadly declared that our dogs had passed away before they arrived. Lisa and I fell asleep and woke up the next morning to the officer from the night before. The weird guy at the end of the road was arrested because he was stupid enough to touch the candy without gloves. Apparently he poisoned the candy with cyanide because the trashy lesbians are an abomination to the world and deserve whatever was coming to them. He was charged and sent to prison. Lisa broke up with me a few days after the incident and checked into an institution because now she suffered from PTSD. I'm sad that my dogs passed away, but I'm grateful that neither Lisa or anyone else in my family had eaten the candy. Who knows what could have happened? I urge you to be careful when you take your little ones or anyone else out trick-or-treating. Please check the treats that you receive carefully and throw out anything that looks like it had been messed with. It's for your own safety. I'm a male, 33 years old, and this happened the one time I decided to join in on the Halloween fun. My town is a small, tight community who watches out for everyone. Strangers don't usually come into town without someone knowing. Here's the events that really made me scared of the world. The Halloween Carnival comes to town every year. It's a town favorite and personally the only thing I have been looking forward to because my parents finally agreed to let me go. I usually wasn't allowed to participate in the festivals due to my health issues while growing up. Let's be honest, being the kid with health issues isn't the ideal way to grow up because no one wanted to be friends with me yet that year. I was excited to be going with the kids next door though. I suited up in the warmest clothes I could find, made sure that I had my inhaler and hurried over to the neighbor's house. The parents drove us to the festival, told us to keep an eye out for anyone we didn't know and to meet back at the entrance in a few hours. The first thing we did was gorge on cotton candy. My parents didn't let me have candy because it was bad for you. Go figure. My stomach was aching by the time we walked across the carnival to the Ferris wheel. I decided to sit down while the other kids did their thing. I was a little upset that I didn't ride with them because they were bragging about how fun it was. Stan wanted to go play the games they had, but Leela, Marco, and I wanted to go to the haunted house. We wasted about 15 minutes arguing before we flipped a coin and decided that the house was next. And that was a big mistake. The haunted house, the ghoulish favorite for teenagers and irresponsible adults, was the biggest event on our to-do list. Naturally, the line was about a mile long. Maybe an hour was spent waiting until we reached the entrance. The worker watching the front door warned us to turn back now or be cursed with the unnerving nightmares that can be caused. Stupid, I wish I would have listened to him though. Leela and I held hands while walking through the first hallway where a zombie jumped out at us. Nothing too scary. The next event was the ghost of a victim who wouldn't rest until she collected what was hers. I didn't get the chance to find out what that was because someone grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the crowd. I screamed as loud as I could, but it was useless with the loud noises and creepy music that was blasting in the cramped building. I thought it was a part of the show when I noticed that the exit was getting further and further away. My breathing started to get heavier. My chest felt like it was tightening, and then I started crying. Something warm ran down my leg, and I knew I was having a panic attack. I fumbled the pocket of my coat for my inhaler, but dropped it when the person pulling me away told me to shut up. I'm not really sure what happened after that because I woke up to the paramedics kneeling beside me holding a mask over my face. I could finally breathe. The man that had pulled me away from Stan, Leela, and Marco was a stranger that had been hiding in the building that they used for the haunted house weeks before the carnival got there. My parents were beyond angry that I had nearly been kidnapped in a crowded place that should have been safe, but the police had failed to have enough patrol around the area. It turns out that Stan had been the first person to realize I wasn't holding on to Leela anymore. He panicked and grabbed the other two so they could get help. Their parents found a police officer and they stormed through the haunted house where they found the man dragging me down an unused corridor. I'm very lucky to have been such a fearful wimp because the other kids wouldn't have even noticed that I was gone if it weren't for them not being able to hear my girlish screams. I guess that you really don't know what kind of people can be lurking around your town, no matter how small it may be. You never really know what could happen in the most crowded of places. I was almost kidnapped in a haunted house, and it turns out that I wasn't the first person he had tried to get. He had been roaming the States for years, and now he's locked away in prison somewhere, while I live in the mountains far from society and far from the criminals that used to be harmless. Don't trust anyone that says a crowded place is the safest. They're just not seeing the bigger picture. I was 8 at the time that this occurred. I'm 16 now, female, and an introvert because the memory of that night is still fresh in my mind. I'm afraid it will be there forever. Here's a little backstory which is important to this story. The horror-obsessed neighbor that I had when I was a kid had to be the only person who truly loved Halloween. It was Miss Tompkins' absolute greatest joy in life, being able to decorate. This year, she went all out on decorating for it. The house was covered in spooky delights, tasty treats were left on the doorstep, and her famous yet terrifying ghouls were placed in coffins throughout the yard. Her house was the last stop on every kid's list simply because it was the one place that could make you scared for your life. I hadn't felt good for the week prior to Halloween, so I laid in bed sick that day. I peered out the window a few times throughout the day, but hadn't seen Miss Tompkins doing the finishing touches to her masterpiece, which was weird. She should have been outside all day, taking pride in what she had created, but she wasn't. No one had seen her since the night before, and my mom was starting to get nervous since they were friends. My older brother begged me to go trick-or-treating with him. I considered lying about feeling better just to get candy, but my dad wasn't having it. He told me that I could help pass out candy. I had soup for dinner, cold medicine, and dressed up warmly with hot chocolate. My dad and I sat on the steps of the front porch, passing out candy to the other kids. They'd dance or tell us a silly joke for the candy and run down the street. Everyone avoided Miss Tompkins' house because her porch light wasn't on. She wasn't looking out the windows like she normally does, and she wasn't answering my mom's calls. A lot of the neighbors knocked on her door. She never answered, so they shrugged it off as her having the flu like much of the neighborhood did, and everyone went home. My dad and I waited on the porch until about 10:30 that night. We decided to call it quits when the last of the stragglers went home and Miss Tompkins never shut off the fireworks like she did every year before. My brother and I stayed up a little later than usual to sort through the candy he had gotten. My parents went to sleep, and soon after that so did I. I woke up the next morning to an empty house. My parents were outside talking to the other neighbors about what went on the night before. I guess my mom had a bad feeling the day before. She tossed and turned all night, so she decided to check and call the police. A few officers checked the area, knocked on the front door, but got no answers, so they called it a night as well. A patrol car had been sent earlier the next morning. He thought the coffin sitting in Tompkins' yard was cool. He walked up to the nearest coffin to admire the hard work that had been put into the decorating. I guess he touched the fake blood around the corpse's neck, and it wasn't corn syrup. Miss Tompkins' ex-boyfriend had been jealous of her new relationship. He had been harassing her for weeks about getting back together, but she refused. She told him that she was doing well since they had broken up, and he didn't take that so well. He waited until early Halloween morning to break into her house, cut her throat while she was sleeping, and he put makeup on her face. He dragged her out of the house and stuffed her body in the coffin before leaving town, and to my knowledge he hadn't been caught and her death was never justified. Miss Tompkins was a good woman that just wanted out of an abusive relationship. I guess she finally got what she wanted, but not the way that she had hoped. Because of how elegant her yard was decorated, it took an entire day to find her. Please be careful what or who you let into your life, or you might just end up like Miss Tompkins, just a ghoulish decoration on display for the entire town to see. I'm a female, 29, and this killed my Halloween vibe. My mentally ill neighbor Ed was on medication the entire time I lived next to him. He was schizophrenic, which means that he hears and possibly sees things that aren't real. He used to freak out and have a fit about what the voices were telling him to do. His parents finally decided to get him help after he was arrested for assaulting one of his co-workers. Ed stopped hallucinating and hearing the voices after he started taking medicine, and he was better, or so I thought. You could actually hold a decent conversation with him for more than 2 minutes. He was a nice, kind man when he wasn't crazy. The neighbors had actually stopped being afraid to let their kids play outside. I could finally get a good night's sleep without hearing Ed's angry voice screaming for people to leave him alone, and I could finally have my boyfriend back. My parents would have had a heart attack if they knew that I had secretly dated Ed. Like I said, he was a good man while on the medicine, and I couldn't help but love him. Mr. and Mrs. Cole had to put up with Ed's mental condition for a long time before they finally hit their breaking point. They sent him to a mental institution where the doctors could treat his condition. Electroshock therapy and whatever they wanted to call it. I couldn't do anything to stop his parents from sending him back, despite him begging me to help. I felt terrible and lost without him around because I couldn't really get inspired to decorate for Halloween when Ed wasn't there to tell me which decorations should be placed where. Ed was always interested in the legend behind Halloween, so I guess you could say that he thoroughly enjoyed the horrific side to things. It was difficult to fall asleep without hearing him shuffling around in his room through my open bedroom window. I would tell you the conversation that I had with Ed on Halloween morning, but I don't think it would be very appropriate due to the nature of it. The evening of Halloween was long, boring, and uneventful. My parents were at a party which left me and my best friend home alone to pass out the candy. My dad wanted me to lock the doors and call the police if Ed were to show up. Apparently he was released from the institution earlier that afternoon and left home shortly after he had gotten there. He didn't talk to me before leaving, so I was worried about where he could have went. My idiot self didn't bother to check the spot where we'd met. That was really stupid on my part. My friend and I were watching a horror movie, the volume blasting, causing us to not hear anything happening around the house or outside. I paused the movie for a bathroom break when we heard screaming outside. I ran to the front door to see what was wrong. Ed was hanging from the balcony of his house. The doctor at the mental institution had been bribed by Ed's dad to do whatever was necessary to fix his son. He wanted the little boy that wasn't crazy back, so the doctor did just that. He terrorized Ed the entire time he was at the institution, which is the reason why Ed had stopped taking his medication in the first place. My boyfriend was so desperate to escape the horrible pain of his mind that he took his own life. I never got to say goodbye to Ed, but I have never forgotten him. If you're struggling or someone you know is struggling with any type of disorder like Ed's, please, 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 listen to what they're telling you even if it sounds insane. This was my horrific Halloween nightmare. I'm a male, 17, and this happened last year. Halloween was never my thing. I just didn't care about the holiday. I had planned on staying home, playing my video games and eating pizza, but my friend somehow convinced me to go to a party at this kid's house, and I knew the kid from school. I'd seen him around a few times. I was told that there was going to be a bunch of kids from my school there, so I figured, what the heck? I can have free drinks, snacks, I can go hang out with friends and get away from my dad scaring little kids for a few hours. Totally worth skipping my normal tradition. My dad begged me to stay home and help him pass out the candy, but I just wasn't feeling it. I told him that I'd be home before midnight. He was nice enough, and my friend Jay pulled up, and I didn't waste any time jumping into the car with him. My dad probably wasn't happy about me riding with Jay since he'd had more speeding tickets than anyone I knew. Jay parked a few blocks away from the party. We walked up the sidewalk, joking about how we would get to see a fight, and was happy to see our other friends waiting for us. I already had a bad feeling about the party. We weren't at the party very long before the bad feeling got worse. The party was going just as I had anticipated it would. However, who I hadn't expected to see, let's call her Marcia, was there. Marcia and I dated for 2 years before she found out that I was cheating on her the entire time. Things didn't end well between us, and before too long she had a new boyfriend. We'll call him Dave. Dave was an idiot. He bossed Marcia around, threatened any guy who talked to her, and had seen the inside of a jail cell one too many times. I was going to say something to Dave. I had finally had enough of his crap, but my friends told me to ignore them. Marcia wasn't worth getting into trouble over, so I left it at that and joined the crowd outside by the pool. I threw back quite a few shots of whiskey before challenging myself to win at beer pong. I kicked major butt at that. My friend tapped me on the shoulder and pointed to Marcia. Of course, she had to be walking towards me. I glared at her until she stopped in front of me. "I didn't expect to see you here," I growled. "Yeah," she chuckled. "I wasn't going to come here, but Dave insisted on seeing the cheating idiot. Well, here I am. I wouldn't get drunk if I were you. Never know what's going to happen." She smiled. "What?" I thought to myself, while Marcia walked back over to her boyfriend. Why would she say something like that? I mean, I knew that she could hold a grudge, but it felt more like a threat to me. I kind of shook the thought away from my mind and stuck close to my friends. We were talking about who would likely graduate high school and become a criminal, just the usual things teenagers like to think about, I guess. I snacked on several things nearby to try and sober up. I generally was all enjoying the company of my classmates before some jerk smacked my drink out of my hand. I turned around to see Dave standing behind me. He was livid. His cheeks were beet red and his jaw was clenched. That evil look in his eye brought out the inner a-hole in me. We exchanged some not nice words, and I was the idiot who threw the first punch. Brawling hadn't ever been my strong suit. Naturally, the criminal destroyed me. I dumped my beer on Dave, and he pulled a rather large hunting knife. I nearly crapped myself when I saw that thing. I knew Dave was dangerous, but I never thought that he'd bring a knife to a party. I felt like I was done. I tried to run away as quickly as possible, but I remember the entire world spinning. I was seeing spots, and I was completely out of my mind. It's hard to run when you can barely form a thought. Dave grabbed hold of my shirt and pushed me to the ground. I will spare you the gruesome details. Needless to say, I now have a prosthetic hand and one incredibly sweet scar from my temple to my jaw. Dave, I will forever regret, was never locked up because he had an incredibly good lawyer, and I spent a long time in the hospital recovering with incredible pain medication, but I still hate Halloween. I hate Halloween, and I'm basically a decoration year-round, so no, I don't think that I'll think of Halloween the same. Halloween revenge. It's basically the best way to never get caught because there are a lot of other criminals roaming the streets on that night. I'm a female, 42, and this is why I can't trust the holiday. My mom and dad adopted me when I was 3 months old because my birth parents couldn't afford to have a child at the time, which is why they gave me the best shot at a good life. My adoptive parents have been the best parents that I could have asked for. They have done everything for me and still continue to be my support system when things go wrong. I'm grateful for them, and I'm glad that they weren't harmed on that night. Halloween was a good time of year for me. I got to spend it with my friends and family. I was able to decorate the house and watch all of the kids in the neighborhood get a good scare from my house. I generally enjoyed being able to sip on apple cider while telling spooky stories to the neighbors' 2 kids. They were good kids that I babysat when I was home from college. I was home for the weekends, so I spent as much time with my parents as I could before I had to go back and finish out the semester. My mom had to make a last-minute shopping trip, so I opted to go with her. We had been walking down the street for about 45 minutes before I even noticed that people passing by were giving us questionable looks. I continued for another few minutes before I leaned close to my mom. "What are they looking at?" I asked my mom. "They're staring at you," she whispered. "Why though? I don't know any of them." I frowned. "Don't think too much of it, honey. They probably just confused you for someone else." Probably." I couldn't stop thinking about the weird looks that those people had given me. I was just walking through town with my mom before we had to pass candy out. We grabbed lunch, finished our last-minute shopping, and headed home to get ready for the night to begin. The freaking sight that I went home to was bizarre. My dad had been watching the news and saw a picture of me. Apparently I had robbed a bank and shot 2 people who were in critical condition earlier that week. The thing that baffled me the most was the fact that I'd never done anything illegal in my entire life. The fact that I was wanted for a crime that I didn't commit sent my mom into high alert. She started talking about the what-ifs of the situation, and my dad seemed to know what she was talking about. The police showed up at my house, arrested me, and brought me in to ask me questions about the robbings and shootings earlier that week. They did release me, but they told me not to leave town because they'd be back if they had any more questions. My family was livid. The entire thing made me sick to my stomach. I laid down in my room for a while before waking up to hear someone screaming downstairs. I hurried down the staircase to see a girl who looked like me screaming at my parents. She was demanding to know why they didn't take her too. Turns out that I was an identical twin. My parents adopted me after another family had adopted her. I got the better end of the adoption because my parents had money, were educated, and had good careers, whereas her parents were drug dealers and she'd been abused her entire life. She dropped out of high school, skipped college, and became a stripper at some club 3 cities over. Her parents had told her about me when she was 21. It took her a few years to finally track me down, and she stalked me for months after finding me. This girl was committing crimes in my town, and people thought it was me, all because I didn't know that I had a twin. My twin was on something, some sort of drug. She was angry and finally had enough of my mom begging for her to just leave us alone that she shot her right in my mom's leg. She ran away from the house. I called for help and my mom was taken to the hospital. The police later arrested my sister for attempting to rob a convenience store a few blocks from my house, and she was charged for the crime she committed and sentenced with 30 years in prison. She writes me occasionally. She threatens my parents and myself because she still can't let go of the fact that I grew up with a better life. At times, I'm still baffled at the fact that she exists at all. It truly was like a horror movie. I feel bad for her, but it's not something that could have been prevented. It happens, and Halloween isn't my holiday anymore, all because of my insane twin.